you've heard stories of things that go bump in the night, but nothing prepares you for when it happens to you. I didn't believe in any of that ghosts, spirits, whatever you want to call them. But that night, that walk home changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun night. My best friend, Lily, and I were at this bonfire party out by the lake, miles from town. You know, the kind of party where everyone's drinking, music's blaring, and you can feel the bass in your chest. We were having a great time, but when it was time to leave, our designated driver, Chris, was completely wasted, stumbling around and making out with some random girl by the fire. There was no way he was driving us home. Lily, ever the responsible one, suggested we walk. It wasn't that far, just a couple of miles back into town, mostly through quiet back roads and a stretch of woods. I didn't love the idea, but staying there with drunk idiots wasn't exactly appealing either, so we decided to go for it. The night was cold, and the moon was just a thin sliver in the sky, barely giving any light. We were walking down a narrow dirt road, our phone flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The bonfire glow was far behind us, and the music had faded to a distant thump. It was just us, the crunch of gravel under our feet, and the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. We were laughing, talking about stupid party drama, when Lily stopped suddenly. She grabbed my arm and pointed behind us. "Do you see that?" I squinted into darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows and the faint outlines of trees. But then I noticed it. A figure standing just off the road, partially hidden behind a tree. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the silhouette. Tall, thin, unmoving. "Probably some drunk guy," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice shook a little. I couldn't help it. There was something wrong about the way it just stood there, watching us. No swaying, no stumbling, just perfectly still. We kept walking, and I tried to brush it off, but Lily kept glancing over her shoulder. I knew she was freaked out, and honestly, so was I. As we walked, I could feel this creeping sensation, like eyes boring into the back of my skull. I turned around and froze. The figure was standing in the middle of the road now, closer than before. But it hadn't made a sound. No footsteps, no wrestling, nothing. Just there, like it had always been. "Let's keep moving," Lily said, her voice tight, almost a whisper. We picked up the pace, our shoes scuffing against the dirt as we sped up, our breaths coming out in nervous puffs of steam. I couldn't help but glance back every few steps, and each time the figure was closer, still standing, still silent. It was as if it was gliding, closing the distance without actually moving. Then something caught my eye, just a glimpse of something off. It was its head. The figure's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, too far to one side, like its neck was broken. And there was something else, its eyes. They weren't eyes at all. Just empty, dark holes that seemed to suck in the light, leaving nothing but a void. "Run," Lily said, and that's when we broke into a sprint, running faster than I'd ever run in my life. We didn't care where we were going, just away from that thing. I could hear Lily's panicked breaths beside me, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. But no matter how fast we ran, it was always there, just behind us. I swear, I could feel the cold radiating off it, like it was reaching out, trying to touch us. We kept running until we saw the outline of an old, abandoned gas station up ahead, a relic from decades past. The windows were boarded up, and the sign hung crooked, barely readable in the dim moonlight. But it was shelter, and we were desperate. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us. I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath, while Lily peered out through a crack in the wood. "Do you see it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "No," she whispered, but I could see her hands trembling. "I don't know where it went." We stood there, panting, surrounded by dust and the smell of old gasoline, waiting for any sign of movement outside. The minutes felt like hours, but then the air changed. It felt heavier, colder. And then the lights, old, flickering fluorescent lights, buzzed to life above us, one by one, even though the place had clearly been without power for years. The hum was deafening, like a swarm of angry bees trapped inside the bulbs. "What the hell?" Lily muttered, looking around in bewilderment. But before I could answer, I saw it again, this time inside with us. Standing in the corner of the gas station, half hidden in shadow, was the figure. Its neck still tilted, head barely attached, staring at us with those empty, hollow eyes. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The lights began to flicker wildly, casting the figure in and out of sight, making it seem like it was moving closer every time the light blinked. I grabbed Lily's arm, and we backed up against the counter, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and it. But then we heard something that chilled me to the bone. A low, wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It was coming from behind the counter, just inches from where we were standing. I leaned over, just enough to see the source. There, on the dirty tile floor, was a trail of dark, slick liquid blood, or something like it, leading to a pair of pale, lifeless legs sticking out from behind the counter. The body was half hidden, but I didn't need to see the face to know it was wrong. The limbs were twisted, bent in ways no human should bend, and the head. The head was turned completely backward, eyes wide open, staring straight at me. Lily and I bolted for the door, but the figure was suddenly blocking our way, closer now than ever. I could feel the cold emanating off it, freezing the air in my lungs. It didn't move, didn't reach out, but I could feel it pulling us in, like we were being sucked into those dark, hollow eyes. Lily grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the back door. We followed the green exit sign. All I remember is running until my legs burned, until we saw the first signs of town, the dim glow of streetlights in the distance. We stumbled onto the main road, breathless, terrified, and no one believed us when we tried to explain. They thought we were just scared girls who got spooked in the dark. But I know what I saw. We never found out who or what was behind that gas station counter. The next day, we went back in daylight, but the place was boarded up, as if it had never been opened in years. And the figure, it was gone. Shortly after Lily had left to go off to college, we lost touch, but the next year, she came back to visit. We met at our usual spot, a bench by the lake. We caught up on gossips before Lily signed and said awkwardly, "I need to tell you something." I waited, but never imagined the mind-boggling story she was about to tell me. "You remember the bonfire night last year when we ran into something unexplainable?" She started off seeming very nervous. "Well, it was my fault what happened to us." "What?" I only managed to utter. "You see, I foraged my grandma's jewelry box for something to match my outfit that night. Grandma said it was all right to take whatever I needed. I found a necklace in the drawer. It matched my outfit to perfection. The day after the bonfire, I went to visit my grandma, and I told her what happened to us. I know she is very spiritual, unlike the rest of the family. I felt I needed to tell someone. Grandma looked mad and asked me if I took a necklace from her drawer. Confused, I said yes before taking it out of my pocket and handing it to her. She quickly put it back in the drawer. Well, here is the kicker. Grandma had a very bizarre story that could explain what happened to us that night. Lily continued. You see, before Grandma had married Grandpa, she had been dating a young man called Brian for over a year, but she had been having doubts about spending the rest of her life with him and was thinking of breaking it off. But Brian had popped the question before Grandma could muster the courage to end their relationship. It goes without saying, Grandma tried to be gentle when she declined and eventually broke things off. Later that evening, Brian had driven his car off a cliff. He did not survive. No one knew that they had broken up, and Grandma had been carrying the guilt ever since. She couldn't tell his family she was responsible. They found the necklace in his pocket when they had recovered the car. His mom insisted that Grandma held on to them. Ever since she got the necklace, she kept seeing Brian, or rather his mangled remains. Grandma believes he is tethered to the necklace, and every time someone wears it, they see him. Lily gave me an apologetic look. I am so sorry I put us through that. We hugged it out. Then Lily added, Mom and I had accompanied Grandma to the cliff where it happened. Grandma had finally said goodbye, threw the necklace into the ocean. This way, Brian can finally be laid to rest. I am glad Lily and her grandma got closure, but I wondered if Brian was hanging about because of some unfinished business. Was it really over? Did he really move on? Or is he still tethered to her grandma? Is he waiting for her in the afterlife, hoping this would be their happy ever after? Last year, I lost both my parents in a car accident. After the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to sort out my parents' home until now. It was the home I grew up in, a place that should have felt safe, but ever since their accident, it felt hollow, like something was missing. They left behind years of collected things, most of which I planned to get rid of. But there was one thing I hadn't noticed before, something that would change everything, a mirror in the basement. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, and my parents rarely used the basement. It was musty, filled with dust, and I always hated going down there as a kid. But there it was, tucked against the wall, half hidden behind boxes of forgotten junk, a tall, ornate mirror with a dark wooden frame. It looked antique, the kind of thing you'd see in a haunted mansion, and I couldn't recall ever seeing it there before. The glass was strangely perfect, without a single speck of dust, as if someone had just polished it. When I looked into it, my reflection seemed off. It wasn't just me staring back. There was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My reflection seemed darker, almost resentful. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, so I shrugged it off and carried it upstairs, thinking it would make a nice addition to my room. But that was my first mistake. It started small, with little things I could easily dismiss. I'd catch movement in the mirror out of the corner of my eye, just shadows shifting or flickers of light that didn't seem right. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe I was just tired from sorting through my parents' things. But it got worse. One night, I was drying my hair in front of the mirror, and for a split second, I saw my reflection smiling when I wasn't. It was so quick that I almost didn't catch it, but the image burned into my mind. My reflection's smile was twisted, like it knew something I didn't. I stepped back, heart racing, staring at myself, but everything seemed normal. I tried to laugh it off, convinced it was just a weird hallucination. But then, things started happening that I couldn't ignore. Objects around the house began to move. My keys would be on the counter 1 second and on the floor, the next without making a sound. The TV would turn on by itself, always to static. Doors would creak open on its own, even when the windows were closed. which cannot be explained away as wind caused the door to open, and every time I passed the mirror, I felt watched, as if my own reflection was judging me. My girlfriend, Tara, moved in with me a few weeks later. I hadn't told her about the mirror. I figured she'd think I was losing it. But the first thing she said when she saw it was, "That thing's creepy. Where did you get it?" I explained that it was just something I found in the basement, and she told me to get rid of it. I laughed it off, but deep down, I felt a pull, like the mirror didn't want me to let go. I ignored her warnings, thinking she was just superstitious, but Tara was the first to realize something was seriously wrong. One night, she woke up screaming, saying she saw someone standing at the foot of our bed. I turned on the light, but no one was there. She was shaking, convinced she'd seen a man with sunken eyes just staring at us. I tried to calm her down, but her fear was infectious. We both knew she wasn't just dreaming. The following morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the mirror to the foot of our bed. They were wet, fresh, like someone had just walked through the house. Tara accused me of playing a prank, but the truth was, I was just as terrified as she was. The mirror wasn't just showing reflections, it was doing something much worse. Determined to figure out what was going on, I did some research. The house's previous owners had moved out suddenly, leaving most of their belongings behind, including the mirror. There was little information about them, but what I found was disturbing. The mirror had been passed down through several generations, each time bringing tragedy to its owners. There were rumors of deaths, unexplained disappearances, and madness. One of the previous owners, a woman named Margaret, had been found dead in front of the mirror, her eyes wide open, as if she had seen something horrific. Her diary entries, which I found in a news article online claiming her death was unnatural, detailed how she'd seen things in the mirror that weren't there. She saw dark figures, shadows, and eventually herself doing things she hadn't done. Margaret's last entry read, "It's not a mirror, it's a door." That night, Tara and I decided to cover the mirror. We draped a thick blanket over it, hoping to put an end to whatever was happening. But as we lay in bed, I heard the faint sound of glass cracking, like ice breaking in the distance. I got up, heart pounding, and pulled the blanket off. The mirror was intact, but the image inside was different. The room reflected in the mirror wasn't ours. It was an old, rotting version of it, with peeling wallpaper and mold creeping up the walls. And then I saw her, Margaret. She was standing in the background, staring at me with empty eyes. I blinked, and she was gone, but I felt a cold presence, as if something was reaching through the glass. I knew then that the mirror wasn't just haunted, it was a portal to something evil, a thin barrier between our world and another. Tara begged me to get rid of it, to throw it away or smash it, but I was scared. Scared that breaking it would release whatever was inside. We decided to move it back to the basement and lock the door, thinking that would keep it contained. That night, the creaking floorboard woke me up. I caught a glimpse of Tara walking out of the bedroom. I would have gone back to sleep, but I realized she was walking in the dark without switching on the lights. There was something off about the whole situation. I followed her, thinking she was going to the kitchen for a glass of milk or water, but instead, she turned and started unlocking the basement door. I called out her name, but she did not react or respond. Terrified, I grabbed her arm, pulled her back out from the top of the stairs, slammed and locked the door. Tara looked at me with a blank look, as if she was sleepwalking. She tried to turn back towards the basement door. In the struggle that ensued, I had to slap her to wake her up. She stared at me in confusion, wondering what we were doing in the kitchen and how did she get out of bed. Needless to say, we packed up a few things and left the house that night. We decided to sell the place and put everything in storage, including the mirror. I couldn't, in good conscience, leave it in the house for the new owners to find. I heard the moving crew had accidentally dropped the mirror, and it had smashed into pieces. That was the best news I could have been given, to the confusion of the moving company. The man on the phone was stupefied when I burst out laughing at the news that the mirror was shattered into pieces while he was trying to apologize. I hope that was the end of it. Clearing out my grandfather's house after his death felt like stepping into a museum of a life well lived. He had raised me after my parents died when I was just a kid, and in those 95 years, he had collected a lifetime's worth of memories, curiosities, and secrets. The house was crammed with relics from every corner of his existence: old books, vintage cameras, military memorabilia, and things I couldn't even begin to identify. But it was the attic that held the real treasures, or so I thought. I spent hours going through boxes filled with dusty photo albums, yellowed letters, and knickknacks from a different era. That's when I found it, an antique watch tucked away in a small, velvet-lined box inside an old trunk. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The watch's face was ornate, with tiny, intricate engravings of strange symbols around the dial. Its gold was slightly tarnished but still gleamed in the light, and the ticking was too loud, almost hypnotic. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't place why. I remember thinking it looked expensive, like it had history. Maybe it was worth something, but instead of selling it, I decided to keep it. After all, it was a small token of my grandfather's life, something to remember him by. I never imagined that decision would lead me down a path I'd never be able to turn back from. The strange occurrences started almost immediately after I took the watch home. First night, I set it on my bedside table, admiring its craftsmanship. At exactly 3:03 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sharp, cold chill in the room. My breath misted in the air, and the watch was ticking loudly, louder than it had any right to. The second hand wasn't just moving, it was twitching erratically, like it was struggling against some unseen force. I told myself it was just old mechanics, that it was nothing. I was wrong. In the days that followed, my luck took a nosedive. I got into a car accident, nothing major, but enough to set me on edge. The mechanic said my brakes had failed, even though they'd been serviced a month ago. Then my work computer crashed, erasing weeks of work, and my boss, normally understanding, was suddenly furious with me for the smallest things. I shrugged it off as a string of bad luck, but the watch never left my side. My girlfriend, Lucy, was the first to really notice. She believed in superstitions, read tarot cards, and had an uncanny sense for bad vibes. She said the watch gave her the creeps, that it felt wrong. "It's not just old," she said one night, staring at it like it was something alive. "It's cursed." I laughed it off, but the thought stuck with me. She kept pressing, insisting that I look into its history, but I didn't take her seriously. That was until the nightmare started. I dreamed of dark places I'd never been, of falling through endless, empty corridors with the deafening sound of ticking echoing all around me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the watch still on my nightstand, always pointed at 3:03, no matter when I looked. Finally, unable to shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong, I decided to dig into the watch's past. I went through my grandfather's old documents, searching for any mention of it. I found a note tucked in the back of an old ledger, written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting.
Watch from the estate of S. Blackwood. Never wear it. It brings death.
That was enough to make my blood run cold, but I needed to know more. I went down a rabbit hole, researching the name Blackwood. Samuel Blackwood was a wealthy businessman in the 1800s, known for his ruthless dealings and cruel demeanor. It was rumored that one of his customers defaulted on his debt. Mr. Blackwood collected on the collateral, which happened to be the watch workshop and shop of the old watchmaker. To add insult to injury, Mr. Blackwood liked the old man's watch, which he promptly took off his wrist. The old watchmaker begged for mercy, begged for the watch to be returned, for it belonged to his late son, who had died the previous summer from a cholera outbreak. This watch was the only thing left of him. Mr. Blackwood scoffed and left the old watchmaker crumpled on the floor. He died the next day from a heartbreak. He had lost everything, his shop, and the last thing that kept him going, his son's watch. The story went that ever since the old watchmaker's death, Mr. Blackwood had suffered a series of misfortune. He went bankrupt within the year. He had numerous accidents, and he eventually met his end in one of them. The watch had passed hands from generation to generation, bringing bad luck and death to its wearer. The last recorded owner before my grandfather was a man who drowned in his own bathtub, even though there was no water when he was found. My grandfather must have acquired it in auction, maybe thinking it was just another collectible. He never wore it, and he lived a long life. But now it was in my possession. The accidents escalated after learning the watch's history. One evening, while Lucy and I were cooking dinner, a knife slipped from the counter, narrowly missing my foot. That same week, a power surge fried every electronic in my apartment, sparing nothing. The watch, though, remained pristine, its ticking constant and relentless. Lucy finally convinced me to visit a medium, a friend of hers who claimed to sense spirits. I was skeptical, but desperation has a funny way of making you consider the impossible. The medium took one look at the watch and refused to touch it. "This isn't just haunted," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a tether. The spirit inside isn't bound to it. It's feeding on it." She explained that destroying the watch wouldn't set me free. It would only unleash whatever was trapped inside. The only way to break the curse was to willingly pass the watch on to someone else, someone who would accept it as a gift, knowing nothing of its dark past. I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to curse someone else just to save myself. Lucy urged me to throw it in a river, to bury it, to do anything but keep it. But deep down, I knew it would find a way back to me. I started to feel trapped, as if every second that passed tightened a noose around my neck. The watch's presence was inescapable, its ticking a constant reminder that time was running out. One night, Lucy and I got into a huge fight. She was fed up, terrified of what the watch was doing to me, to us. She left, saying she couldn't stay around it anymore, and I don't blame her. I was losing myself, consumed by fear and indecision. I knew what had to be done, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. That night, I sat in my apartment alone, the watch ticking louder than ever. It was as if it was urging me to act, to give in. I stared at it, feeling its pull, and for the first time, I felt sympathy for the old watchmaker. This watch, this cursed object, was his way to get justice from a cruel, cruel man, but he has turned into something else, forever repeating the cycle and never getting peace. The next morning, I made my decision. I walked into a pawn shop on the outskirts of town, placing the watch on the counter. The shopkeeper, a grizzled man with tired eyes, admired its craftsmanship, unaware of the dark legacy he was holding. I could feel the weight lifting as I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, I hesitated. "Pay," I said, turning back. "You should know." But then I stopped. The shopkeeper looked at me, eyes gleaming with the excitement of a potential sale. I couldn't bring myself to say it, to doom another person to this nightmare. I just nodded, forced a smile, walked out, leaving the watch behind. As I stepped into the street, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in months. But then I heard it faint, almost imperceptible, the ticking. I looked back at the shop window, and there it was, the watch glinting in the light, still keeping perfect time. I knew then that it would never really be gone. The watch would find another owner, another life to consume. I had escaped, but only by passing on the curse to another poor soul. And somewhere, in the shadows, the ticking continues. I wish I could say this is where the story ends, but it's not. It never is. I'll never forget the night my dad came home from another business trip with that doll. He always brought back something special for me, his little princess, as he liked to call me. My dad ran his own business. He was on the road a lot, but he made up for it with gifts, toys, or jewelry. But this time, the gift he brought home would turn our lives into a nightmare. A storm was brewing that night with strong wind and rain when my dad walked through the door, soaked to the skin. I was 6 years old, bursting with excitement, eager to see what he'd brought me this time. From his travel-worn suitcase, he pulled out a doll unlike any I'd ever seen. She was old-fashioned, dressed in a faded blue Victorian dress with lace trim. Her porcelain skin was cracked in places, and her eyes were the strangest part. They were big, glassy, and lifelike.
This one's special,
My dad said, smiling.
Found her at an old shop in New Orleans. They say she's a collector's item.
I would later find out that he forgot to buy me a gift. On his way to the airport, he saw this shop when the taxi had stopped at a red light. He quickly popped into the shop and bought the doll, even though the atmosphere in the shop creeped him out. I didn't care where she was from. I just knew I loved her. I named her Margot and took her everywhere. I'd talk to her, brush her hair, and prop her up on my bed at night. But it didn't take long for things to start going bump in the night. The first strange thing happened a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was my parents talking downstairs. But when I got out of bed, I realized the voices were coming from Margot. It was faint, like someone whispering through a wall, and I couldn't make out the words, but I was sure it was her. I pressed my ears against Margot. The whispering was louder. Scared, I stepped back and stared at her. I still couldn't make out any of the words. Was it even English? I crawled back into bed, bringing the duvet up to my chin, staring at Margot. I fell asleep at some point. I told my dad the next morning, but he just laughed it off.
It's just your imagination, sweetie. Dolls don't talk.
But things only got worse from there. Margot would appear in different parts of the house, even though I was the only one who moved her. One day, I found her sitting on the kitchen counter, staring straight at the doorway. Another time, she was in the bathroom, perched on the sink, looking at herself in the mirror. I'd wake up at night and find her on the floor next to my bed, her eyes staring up at me as if she'd fallen there by herself. My mom started getting concerned when she found claw-like scratches on the walls near my room. Weirdly, the scratches seemed to grow deeper every day. At first, They blamed the dog, but after we found the same scratches on the ceiling, yes, the ceiling, they didn't have an explanation. My dad just dismissed it as old house noises, cracks in the paint. But we knew something was wrong. Then Margot started moving in front of us. It wasn't blatant. She would just shift. You'd blink, and she'd be slightly turned, just enough that you knew it wasn't right. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I watched her head slowly turn towards me. I screamed, but my dad said it must have been my imagination, that I was making things up. My mom looked worried, but she didn't say anything. One night, I woke up to the sound of Margot's music box playing. I didn't even know she had one. The haunting, slow melody filled my room, and there she was, sitting in my bed, her head tilted, her eyes staring blankly at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The doll's mouth was moving ever so slightly, whispering in that same hushed tone. I bolted from the bed, running to my parents' room. But when we returned, Margot was back on her shelf, and the music had stopped. After that, things got worse. Our dog, Toby, who had always been my best friend, refused to come into my room. He'd bark and growl at Margot, his hackles raised, as if he saw something we didn't. My mom tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She'd find Margot on the kitchen counter or the living room when she was not there a minute ago, the doll's eyes following her every move. One night, my dad, ever the skeptic, finally saw something he couldn't explain. He was working late in his study when he heard a faint giggle. He looked up and saw Margot standing in the doorway, perfectly still, her head cocked to one side. He swore she hadn't been there when he started working. He walked over to pick her up, and as he reached out, her eyes blinked. Freaked out, Dad picked up Margot to put her back on the shelf in my bedroom, holding her by the waist with her back facing him, arms stretched out like he was holding a pot of boiling water, when Margot's head turned 180 degrees to stare at him. Shocked, Dad opened the first door he saw, which was the utility closet, and threw her in before shutting the door. He didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The final straw came when my mom woke up in the middle of the night to find Margot lying on the foot of their bed, nestled between them like a sleeping child. My dad, the man who always prided himself on logic and reason, finally broke. The next morning, he grabbed the doll and took it straight back to the shop in New Orleans. He didn't ask for a refund, didn't want an explanation. He just wanted it gone. The shopkeeper took Margot back with a knowing smile, as if he'd seen this all before. As he left the shop, my dad heard Margot's music box play one last time. The haunting melody echoed in his ears as he walked away, faster than he'd ever walked in his life. After my dad returned Margot to the shop in New Orleans, we felt an uneasy sense of relief. The house seemed quieter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. There were no more scratches on the walls, no faint whispers in the dark, and for the first time in months, we slept without fear. We thought it was over. We thought we were safe. Months later, my dad received a call from an unknown number. It was a man asking to speak to Mrs. Monaghan. It turned out he had purchased the doll from that shop and found a label on the back of the doll with our name and phone number. Mom had forgotten she had put a label on the back of the doll in case I dropped it when we were out and about. If someone found it, they could return it to us. Unfortunately, the man and his family were going through the same thing we went through. I could see the fear in my dad's eyes, a kind of fear I'd never seen in him before. I overheard him talking to Mom late that night, muttering about how he should have destroyed the doll, about how he never should have brought it into our lives. Margot wasn't just an ordinary doll. She was part of something much darker, After some discussion, Dad paid someone to investigate the shop and the doll's history. What we learned was far more disturbing. The shop where Margot had come from was tucked away in the French Quarter, hidden between antique stores and voodoo shops. It was called the House of Lost Things, a name that hinted at secrets best left buried. The shopkeeper was an old man with a thin frame and eyes that seemed far too aware, like he knew something you didn't. Locals called him Mr. Delacroix, but no one knew his first name or how long he'd been there. The shop seemed timeless, as if it had always been part of the city, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander in. Mr. Delacroix dealt in curiosities, objects that carried dark histories, items that whispered of curses and tragedies. He didn't just sell things, he sold stories. But Margot wasn't just a product on his shelf. She was a tool, a vessel for something far more sinister. As the story goes, Margot was once owned by a wealthy plantation family in the late 1800s. The daughter of the family, a girl named Annalise, was obsessed with the occult, dabbling in seances and dark rituals that her parents dismissed as childish games. One night, she performed a ritual with the doll, hoping to summon the spirit of a lost sibling. But something else answered her call. Annalise fell deathly ill, her once vibrant personality twisted into something unrecognizable. She claimed the doll spoke to her, told her secrets about the people around her, and urged her to do things she wouldn't dare speak of. After Annalise's untimely death, the doll was passed from family to family, each time bringing misfortune, madness, and sometimes worse. The locals began to whisper that the doll was cursed, possessed by something that fed on the misery it caused. Mr. Delacroix was more than just a shopkeeper. He was a collector of cursed objects, items that carried not just history, but power. He didn't sell these objects to make money. No, that was just a front. His true purpose was far more disturbing. He believed that each cursed item he sold was a link in a grander ritual, a way to gather energy from the suffering of those who owned them. The more pain and fear these items caused, the stronger the connection to the dark forces he worshipped. Margot was his prized possession, the centerpiece of his collection. He didn't just sell her, he carefully chose her next owner, always finding someone vulnerable, someone who wouldn't question the whispers in the dark until it was too late. He was patient, knowing that every new victim would bring more energy to his cause. Each sale was another step in a ritual that had been ongoing for over a century, a ritual designed to open a door to something far worse than a mere haunted doll. When my dad had returned Margot, Mr. Delacroix wasn't angry. He was thrilled. He didn't care who brought the doll back, only that it kept moving, kept spreading its darkness, its misery. He knew someone else would come along, someone who would unwittingly take the doll home and unleash its terror all over again. The shopkeeper sold Margot to a new customer, a young couple who were expecting their first child. The woman was drawn to the doll's old-fashioned charm, completely unaware of the evil it carried. Delacroix watched them leave with a smile, knowing that Margot's work would continue. The doll never stayed in one place for long, and that was Delacroix's plan all along. Each new owner added to the doll's legacy of pain, feeding the darkness inside it. The shopkeeper would find another victim, and another, until his ritual was complete, and whatever was trapped inside Margot was finally unleashed. The nightmares never stopped. Sometimes I'd wake up in the dead of night, sure I could hear faint whispering, like Margot was in the room with me. I would see a shape on the floor next to my bed, But when I switched on the light, there was nothing there. We thought we got rid of her. But deep down, I knew the truth. Once Margot had marked the families, she is always present but out of sight, feeding on our misery. And somewhere, in a dimly lit shop in New Orleans, the house of lost things waits for its next visitor.